Have you ever been accused of spoiling your kids? Do you believe it's possible to actually spoil your children? The common message is that as we move away from punishment, we are spoiling our kids and are in danger of raising a generation of undisciplined children. Today, Alfie Kohn shines light on the heated topic, and you may be surprised to hear him say that spoiled kids are a myth. Honestly, you don't want to miss this episode. Alfie Kohn writes and speaks widely on human behavior, education and parenting. His 13th book is titled The Myth of a Spoiled Child, challenging the conventional wisdom about children and parenting. Kohn's work has been translated into 16 languages. Of his earlier titles, the best known are Punished by Rewards, No Contest, The Case Against Competition, and Unconditional Parenting, moving from rewards and punishment to love and reason. Kohn has been described in the Times magazine as perhaps the most outspoken critic of education's fixation on grades and test scores. He has been featured on hundreds of TV and radio programs, including The Today Show and 2 appearances on Oprah. Alfie, I'm really excited to have you join us today on Empowered Kids TV and to share all your knowledge in your new book, The Myth of a Spoiled Child.
Glad to be here. The new book, The Myth of the Spoiled Child, is more a critique of cultural norms and attitudes about children and parenting. I do want to make it clear that in terms of spoiling, I don't mean to talk about spoiling kids with material goods. I do think it's possible to buy too much stuff for kids. We're talking here about spoiling in a different sense. The belief that giving kids too much say about their lives or picking up a baby when she cries, that will spoil them psychologically speaking. That's what I want to challenge.
In your first chapter of the book, you examine in quite a lot of detail the claim that permissive parenting is on the rise, and by extension, the volume of spoiled kids. Can you share your findings with us?
Well, this is a claim that we've heard quite often. That children are spoiled and have a sense of entitlement, and that parents are too permissive, that they don't set proper limits and discipline their kids. Unlike the good old days when parents laid down the law and children knew what was good for them a few decades ago. So I go back and look a couple of decades ago and find that people were making exactly the same claims, hearkening back to another era. And I go back then another couple of decades and find exactly the same thing. So there is absolutely no evidence that I can find indicating that permissive parenting or spoiled kids are particularly widespread today, let alone that they're more widespread today than they used to be. So these claims are perennials, and they tell us more about the people making the claim than they do about the actual situation with children or parents today.
If there's no evidence to support that permissive parenting is on the rise, why is the claim so widely accepted?
Well, I'm not sure. I think it may have something to do with the way that older people tend to look down on and disparage younger people. And I think that's something that's always been true. We're impatient with kids. It may also have to do with a more general tendency to look back on times past through some golden haze as the good old days. Things are going downhill. Conservative people and older people tend to believe that more commonly in general, although that just then sets the question back a step, and the question is, why would having children be docile and obedient and parents being strict and authoritarian be construed as the good old days? Even if that were true, I would consider it to be horrifying. But many people believe it's both a good thing and that it was more common in days of yore. So I'm not sure I completely understand it. I just think it's interesting to explore, A, the fact that there's no evidence to support it, and B, to figure out why so many people cling to this idea that that's the way things ought to work.
Another claim that's floating around is that we're over-coddling our kids or over-parenting our kids, almost raising our kids in a bubble. And the claim is suggesting that kids that are over-coddled will not be able to stand on their own 2 feet when they go out into the real world. What are your thoughts on over-parenting and its effects?
First, I think it's interesting and almost a little amusing to try to reconcile this claim that kids are over-parented with the equally common claim that kids are raised too permissively, which may be a way of saying they're under-parented. Anything that disparages children seems to be accepted, even if it contradicts the last thing you said 10 minutes ago. Again, there's not very much evidence, if any at all, to support the idea that over-parenting, assuming we could agree on exactly what that means, really is very pervasive. In general, what research supports about raising children is that the far greater danger is that children will not be supported enough by their parents. Now, is it possible there's such a thing as too much? Perhaps, but we'd have to be very careful to specify how much is too much, or more accurately, what kind is too much. And in the book, I try to figure out that ultimately it's not just how much or what kind, it's the motives for over-parenting. The kind that proves to be genuinely troubling and I think destructive for children is a form of parenting that's really based on too much control, not too much indulgence. And to that extent, it's an extension of the same problem that I believe we've had for centuries, which is parents who do things to their children to make them obey instead of working with their children to help solve problems together. And I explore this in some detail, including the commonly heard charge that parents are too closely connected to their young adult children who've gone off to university, for example. But the idea that if you are too close to your kids and doing too much for them, they will be incompetent and helpless once they get out into the cruel and miserable real world is a claim for which I have found no evidence at all. It might be true in some cases, and some of the extreme anecdotes you tend to find in newspapers and magazines, but what little research exists on what we call helicopter parenting of young adults suggests that close involvement is generally a good thing, particularly from students who are the first in their families to go to university, and particularly for those who have grown up in a culture or subculture that values interdependence and not just independence. Sometimes it's the case that affluent, mostly white, middle class, highly educated parents, who tend to be the ones who write the articles and books, have a kind of one-size-fits-all attitude that self-sufficiency and independence is good for everyone and should be imposed on children as often as possible. That's not necessarily what benefits kids. It reflects ideology more than good psychology.
One of the things that a lot of parents have started to do, as we become more aware of the negative effects of punitive parenting, parents are trying to find a balance between punitive and permissive. In the book, you make it clear that this really isn't the ideal solution. So I just wanted to talk a bit about that, why it's not ideal, and what we should be aspiring to.
First of all, I think that permissive parenting is probably far rarer than punitive parenting. I think the vast majority of parents, at least in Europe and North America, are so afraid of being tagged as permissive that they overcompensate by being over-controlling. And yet we tend to beat down any possible sign of permissiveness as if that were the greater problem. But, as you correctly point out, it doesn't mean that I'm endorsing permissiveness where we let kids do whatever the hell they want to and just sit back and say they can raise themselves. I think that's mostly a caricature offered by traditionalists to defend traditional authoritarian parenting. But I think the alternative to what I called a doing to approach is not doing nothing. It's what I call a working with approach, which takes a lot more skill and talent and time than either old-fashioned my way or the highway approach on the one hand, or on the other hand, then letting kids do whatever they want while we busy ourselves on our smartphones. So the idea that there are some families where one parent is punitive and the other one's permissive, as if two dysfunctional approaches magically cancel each other out and produce health. But and each one points to the other as sort of a foil. Don't be like that, you have to be like this. That's why false dichotomies are always popular. They make choosing easy. But the real alternative is more complicated, takes more time to explain. There's no one-size-fits-all recipe, but it doesn't look like either of those two alternatives.
Taken away from the key points of this interview, I think the first thing that resonated with me is that there is absolutely no evidence to suggest that we can spoil our kids, even though it is a affair. So one of the things that I found as a parent I walked around with was the view that I was always being judged for moving away from punitive methods. In the days when my kids were toddlers, I was very skilled at naughty corners, and my kids knew that there would be a naughty corner anywhere we were, so they had to be on the straight and narrow. And people commented, "Ooh, your kids are so well behaved." And when we moved away from that based on discussion, you could feel judged as a parent, because now your kids don't jump when you say jump. They will turn around and say, "Not now, Mom, may I have 5 minutes before I respond to your request?" And other parents actually look at you like you've moved away from being the sort of parent to command respect. And that's one of the key questions that I wanted to end with. As parents, should we demand respect from our kids, or is it something that we also need to work towards in a work-with sort of relationship?
The naughty corner idea is one of the most pernicious ways to punish a child. And a lot of people will say to you, do a naughty corner, do a timeout instead of spanking a child. Now, if those are your only choices, punishment A and punishment B, it's time to find a new advisor, But this is the ultimate in conditional parenting. The naughty corner says, I'm going to separate you from me, physically as well as emotionally, when I don't approve of what you've done, as if I'm turning off the love. And for a young child, that can be devastating. What about the pressure to get kids respect? Well, in the new book, The Myth of the Spoiled Child, I talk about different ways of defining respect. I mean, I come at it almost like an analytical philosopher and say it turns on the way we use the word. If we mean by respect treating other people decently across the board, then yeah, that's a good thing. But you can't make someone else do that. And using punishment or reward certainly isn't going to do it. Second meaning might be you respect people for specific things that person has done or qualities that they have. And here you do have to earn respect. An adult has to earn the respect of a child by being that kind of person. You can't demand it just by being older or stronger. The third kind of respect is really something close to fear. And that's what I think most conservatives who say kids need to respect their elders, or the trouble today is parents aren't respected by their children anymore. What they mean is that children are not cowed, that they're not, that they don't show a blind deference to them just by virtue of the fact that they are parents. And I don't think that's particularly desirable. What I think is more interesting is that the people who talk that way act in a way that's profoundly disrespectful of children. And that very phrase sounds weird to us. Are you respectful of your child? Seems weird, as if the term doesn't even apply, as if it's a category error, So it depends what kind of respect you're looking for. The kind of respect that I think is legitimate is the kind you can't just demand.
Thank you so much, Alfie, for sharing with us today. I think you were able to help us, again, make that shift mentally from the doing to approach to the working with approach as we guide our kids. So thank you very much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for your questions.
Each week we'll end our episodes with empowered actions. Remember, insight without action is simply worthless. So let's get to work. First, identify the type of parenting technique that you use. Then, list your tools and techniques under the headings of passive, punitive, and guidance. Next week, we'll take the conversation further as we explore the foundation of self-esteem. Did you find value in this episode? If so, be sure to hit the like button. Also, let your voice be heard and share your comments or pose your questions in the comment section below. Remember, this is all about expanding our collective awareness as parents, so be sure to share with at least 2 friends today. They'll love you for it.